Good day to all the aviapreneurs joining us today in this new episode of AviaPreneurs podcast. In today's episode, we are going to discuss podcasts for the aviation industry. And my guest for today's podcast is another podcaster whom I'm very happy to know and share experience and knowledge with, Mr. Jon Howell. Good day, Jon. Thank you for joining me today.
It's great to be with you, Adnan. Great to be with a fellow podcaster.
Thanks for you. So, Jon, you're an aviapreneur from the UK. You're the founder and CEO of AviaDev, which is a platform dedicated for improving air connectivity. And then in 2016, you started AviaDev Africa, which is a conference. It's a conference, right? It's air route development conference focusing on the development of routes to, from, and within the African continent. And after that, you started AviaDev Insights Africa, which is a podcast dedicated to the aviation industry in Africa. Earlier in your career, you were also the manager of sales, the regional sales manager for routes, responsible for Europe and Africa. And you're also a visiting professor to Coventry University as well.
Correct. Yeah.
What an amazing experience to start a podcast. So we're going to focus on the topic of today's episode, which is podcast for the aviation industry. Why did you start your podcast? When did you start it? You started in 2018, you mentioned to me.
Yeah, April 2018. So is when we started it. And why we started it and why I started it is quite simple, really. The honest truth was that there wasn't a lot of information about African aviation out there, and what was there wasn't actually coming from the African market. A lot of it was coming from outside. It was opinions from other people. And what I thought I could do, and I'd been doing some blogging beforehand, so I'd posted over 100 blogs on LinkedIn, and I've used LinkedIn very successfully to grow my network, grow my business. But that's a lot of work because obviously you have to go and find the information. And the whole idea with the podcast was, let's bring the African voices to the platform, to the microphone, and let them tell their story. So I'm not telling the story on their behalf. They're doing it for themselves. And all I have to do is ask the right questions. And hopefully the industry will appreciate this new way of communicating. And obviously you saw that too. You enjoy this way of consuming information.
Yeah, actually, I used to write a lot like you do on LinkedIn, on blogs. I wrote books, articles in newsletters and magazines, but I figured out that the world is turning into audio and video, and it's easier, faster, and at the same time closer to the audience, which is the reason I started my podcast as well. So in your podcast, you're focusing on the aviation industry in Africa. So you have guests in your podcast. It's not just a commentary podcast. You have guests, you talk to them, you ask them questions, and they share their insights, right?
That's exactly it. So for me, the format that I wanted to bring and the way that AviaDev is as a whole platform, when we started, I began with a live event, which we ran for 2 years in Kigali in Rwanda. And then we took it for 2 years to Cape Town. And then, of course, we had COVID 2 months before I was due to do the first AviaDev in Madagascar, which was a bit of a disaster. But luckily, we were saved by the fact that we had this digital presence through LinkedIn and email and the podcast. So that allowed us to stay relevant during that time. But the way that we do the way that I do the setup is, yeah, I will ask the questions. I'll set those up beforehand. And it may be previewing an event that's coming up. It may be interviewing somebody who's new to a role, or it could be a follow-up on a really interesting news story as well with some of the protagonists. So as I was saying before, the whole idea is to allow the audience to hear the voice of the influential people, not my voice. I'm just the microphone that's allowing these other people to tell their own story. And yeah, the feedback we've had over the years has been great. So that's the format that works for me. I know it's different depending on whoever is doing the podcast and what they're trying to achieve, but it definitely works for us. And I learn a lot along the way as well.
So amazing. So far you have, as you mentioned, 225 episodes. This means you've been doing this for more than 4 years. If we say that, as you mentioned, it's in April 2018, so it's 4 years and a half. And I'm sure you have a lot of experience and the stories to share with the audience. So let me start by asking, how was the impact of the podcast on your business? your AviaDev? Was it positive and as you wished it to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing is, if you do one event per year, then what happens and what traditionally happens with event companies is they have a run up where they sell the tickets for say 3 or 4 months out, and they're very loud and they're making all this noise, and then they deliver the event and then they disappear for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, whatever it may be, until that time comes around again. And they may go and work on another project in another part of the world, or they may do something different. So what this allowed me to do from a business perspective is stay relevant all year, because I'm going to Cape Town tomorrow to an event. I've got multiple podcasts set up that I will record live and release over the coming weeks. And it gives me that opportunity to have a reason to go to obviously get some time with some of the most influential people as well, and allow them to tell their stories. So from a business perspective, it really kind of elevates that. And also, of course, we have our event works with sponsorship, and putting in a podcast as part of a sponsorship. And these companies that do sponsor our events, they have really interesting stories to tell, new customers, new products, new services for the African market. So it's about them telling their African stories through the podcast too. So yeah, we interview individuals that obviously represent some of the biggest organizations in the world, and they're our partners through the whole year. So we don't see it as a sponsorship. It's more like a partnership. If they have a new white paper or a new product or a new customer, then we can help them get that message to market through our channel, which is quite an interesting way to do it as well, through the podcast.
Absolutely. And while your podcast is focusing on the African aviation industry, but you have listeners and audience from all over the world, from more than 180 countries. So how do you reach the listeners? I mean, your podcast, is it audio only, or you also do video at the same time?
Yeah, we put most of the podcasts out on our YouTube channel. So I think we've got about 600 videos or something on the AviaDev YouTube channel, only because a lot of the software we use nowadays, it's so easy to just put the video out as well as the audio. And it's not up to me to dictate to somebody how they like to consume information, just because I like podcasts. I'm a voracious podcast listener, because as you were saying before, it gives people that opportunity to go for walk the dog, go for a run, go to the gym, drive their car, and they can still consume the information. Whereas obviously with a YouTube video, you've got to sit there, you've got to watch it and listen to it at the same time. It's not that people don't want to do that. It's just we all live busier lives than ever, and people are choosing to listen to these things in their own time. So we're on all the platforms, just like you are. I think you're on a few more than us. Like I haven't ventured into TikTok, for example. I don't really see that we need to be there to promote it. But of course, we promote it through our social media, and then it's available for free on all of the mainstream platforms like Spotify and TuneIn, Google, Apple, and obviously just directly through the through the URL as well. But the other beauty of the podcast is when it's audio only, it's much smaller in terms of the amount of data that you require. So you could download it while you're on the Wi-Fi and then listen to it when you're on a flight in airplane mode or whatever it may be. And it's not eating into your data anywhere near as much. So for all those reasons, it's done really well. And we're pretty uniform in terms of the kind of the appetite for it. But what I understand with the podcast is it's super niche. There's only certain people in the world that are ever going to want to listen to this, but we can be just focused on those people. And I was really surprised. Yeah, like you say, 180 plus countries and 70 odd thousand listeners. So we're pretty happy with that.
Absolutely. Yeah, as you mentioned, for us it's the same. We're mainly using YouTube as our main platform, and of course we use all the audio podcasting, Spotify, Audible, Apple, all the others. We're available on them. Actually, there are tools now. You just publish once and they distributed to all the podcasting platforms. We used all social media channels at the beginning. We used Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, as you mentioned, but then we realized our main audience are mainly LinkedIn and Instagram. So we focus on them to distribute, and we just stop continuing to do any publication on the rest of the social media platforms. And currently, our main measure for the success of the podcast is LinkedIn. to increase the followers of the page and the people who are interested. And we're trying to make a following and a small platform on LinkedIn for discussion, which is because the aviation professionals are mostly using LinkedIn compared to even going to YouTube itself. But at the same time, as you mentioned, audio is amazing. Actually, I thought about only doing audio, but then I realized we lose some of the benefits of having audio. Audio is easier. It's easier for me. It's easier for the audience. I have many guests who come to me, oh, I thought this is audio only. If it's video as well, I cannot do it today. We have to reschedule. I'm not prepared. So audio is easier for everyone. But I think for the audience, knowing the people, seeing them, it will be more beneficial to the audience. And having both options is amazing. And at the same time, it's very beneficial for the guest as well, because the podcast can be used as the guests can use the podcast itself as a marketing message for their company. They can put it on their website and on their socials, and they can benefit from it themselves. So we decided, same like you did, to use both video and audio at the same time, and it's doing quite well.
No, that's great. And I think, you're on the same page as me in terms of that. And as I say, it's not up to you or me to dictate how somebody consumes content. Some people like to read, some people like to listen, some people like to watch. You can do that now. Obviously, there are tools that could transcribe the podcast and you could put it out. For me, I don't know who that would appeal to personally. Like, obviously, if you turn that into an article and you pick out the gems of the conversation, but that isn't my role. I'm not a traditional media house. I work with those partners. And to be honest, I actually do a lot of collaboration. So we did a podcast last week that one of my media partners that is a publication, that is a news publication, they actually cover it on their website. So they wrote a story about it and embedded the podcast in there, and everybody benefits then. The host, me, I get more listens through that way. They get a free story, which is trustworthy and organic, and the guest, which was actually previewing an upcoming conference, they get the extra reach and the extra benefit. So one of the big things that I'd like to sort of push as well, and I'm sure you do this like we are today, is it's about collaboration. That's how we grow, through collaborating and lifting each other, really, and supporting each other's efforts.
Definitely. So in your podcast, you discuss topics about the aviation industry in Africa. You do that about the industry in general, not just about route development, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we try to focus in on that, but then there's some really interesting stuff out there that I don't want to miss out on that is very Africa-centric. So we don't go too far away from our core, and we'll normally bring it back to that as well. But there are times when we deviate a little bit away from that, because there's so many factors that that affect route development in Africa. So therefore, you have to be aware of those. You can't just talk about one thing without thinking about the macro environment.
Definitely, taxation, repatriation of funds, many issues in the regulatory availability of ground services, safety and security. All of this affect the route development, definitely. So actually, the aviation industry is very much connected. So one factor affects everyone. In my podcast, we discuss entrepreneurship in the aviation industry. The reason why I was able to coin the word AVIAPRENEURS. And I was very happy when I found aviapreneurs.com available to book it. So, and I talk about people from all over the world, from all the segments in the supply chain in the aviation industry. And frankly, it's a learning lesson for me. Every week, I learn from someone about their business, how they started, what the challenges for their company and in their part of the industry, and what the recommendation and the views they have about the industry. And it's very interesting exercise. I mean, I get a lot of ideas to improve my business, and I'm sure the audience at the same time. So I would like to discuss with you the length of the podcast. How long is your podcast? I started hoping to reach for 1 hour, and then I discovered 1 hour is very long for audience. At the same time, there was some episodes I did for 15 minutes. It was short. So I settled for 30 minutes, more or less. What do you think is the best length of a podcast?
Yeah, after having done all of these, so we actually had AviaDev Europe as well. So we had 150 episodes of that podcast. So we've done about 400 podcasts across the AviaDev sort of portfolio. But for me, what you said at the beginning, 20 to 30 minutes, I think for this type of podcast, obviously you have certain guys that have done really well by doing 2 hours, and others that are, if they're daily or something like that, they can be a 5-minute snippet. I mean, even in those 4.5 years since I started, the amount of podcasts that are out there, we still have 24 hours in the day. We still have to sleep. We still have to eat. We still have to interact with people. We still have to do our jobs. So there's more competition than ever for the listenership. So I don't take it for granted at all. And that's where I think that you have to just be focused in on something. I mean, I love AVIAPRENEURS is such a great term. I think you could really expand on that, and there could be some sort of incubator, and get some of these guys in to share their learnings. I really think that you're onto something with that side of things. But I think for me, it's 20 to 30 minutes. Keep it to the point, but long enough, because otherwise, if people just want a quick hit, they can get that on their social media, and they like the 5-second interactions and that sort of thing. They're coming to the podcast because they want to know more, because that will benefit their business, or they're genuinely interested in the guest, and they trust the host to ask the right questions. I think that's important too.
And what about the benefits that your guests got from the podcast? I had some clients, some people interacting with me and telling me, can I get a connection with this guest, because I'm very interested in what he does and I would like to communicate with him about potential opportunities. Have you witnessed something like that?
Yeah, so what I tend to do in the show notes is put a LinkedIn connection to the person that's on it, so that person can directly connect and go, hey, I just listened to you on Jon's podcast, I'd like to connect. And then obviously organically off the back of that, they're doing that. So it's something that, of course, people come to me and say, oh, right, I'm doing this, could you help me connect or whatever? And it obviously depends on what the approach is, but it's just great to hear that people are listening. And this is how it starts. But exactly like you're saying as well, both from a personal perspective. So it might be somebody who is in a big company, but they're new to the market, they're new to the region. So what a great opportunity to tell their story. What were you doing before? Who are you? Then when they turn up at events, and I go to this event this week, and people will be like, oh, I know who you are already because I listened to you on Jon's podcast. And then by connection, that gives me more kudos with them, more sort of goodwill with them, because they're saying, oh, it's really helped me get a step up into a new market. And the truth is, with the African aviation route development market, it's very small. So, as a community, 500 to 1,000 people really are the people. That's how big it is. Obviously, there's more people interested in it, but those involved, there's only that many. So, it's a small world.
Indeed, definitely. Yes, it's a small world. But and that's the reason why success in our kind of podcast, which is a B2B podcast in a niche, is measured in different terms from mainstream general podcast. I mean, I cannot imagine to have 100,000 listeners per episode, because I don't think in my podcast I address entrepreneurs and founders of companies in the aviation industries. So I imagine my audience to be other founders, other CEOs, some staff and employees working for aviation companies. I cannot imagine anyone to be an audience. So how do you measure the success of your podcast? What are the metrics you use?
I totally agree. I think like any business and like anything in this day and age, that the things that get the bright lights are the podcasts with the huge followings and the huge listenership. As I was saying before, what I've seen over those 4 years is the amount of podcasts. They're not all about what I do, but I understand that somebody might have half an hour and they can choose to listen to my podcast or the latest Premier League podcast, for example, or something. They can choose. It's their time. Nobody's telling them they have to listen. So you're fighting for every listener. And I think that now it's even harder than it was then because of sheer volume. So for me, I'm with you. I think it's quality over quantity, and it's in feedback, and it's in people actually reaching out and saying, hey, I listened to it. Like you said before, can you connect me? Can I find out more? And if they're the right people and they give you the feedback, I think that's very important, is that you get the feedback from the guests too, to show them the value of what you're doing it, because you're not doing it for that reason per se. You're doing it to spread the word. But to measure just on volume of listeners when you're niche, I think is wrong. But I would also say that if you go and start today a very general podcast, you're going to struggle to get any listeners, because there's probably other general podcasts that are already established that are doing that. When I choose a podcast, I want to go because I want it to be about Manchester United, and that's all. I don't, or whatever it may be. And if you know that that's what you're signing in to listen to, that's what you're going to get. And if people want African aviation, they can only come to one place, which is my podcast. If they don't, then I'm not the podcast for them. But it's pretty obvious who I'm for and who I'm not. I think that's better than being a generalist.
Yeah, amazing perspective. Actually, the narrower you go, actually, the bigger the opportunity that opens up. This is same for business. Specialization actually pays off. It's scarier at the beginning. Why I'm losing a lot of opportunities, but to specialize, it opens a lot of doors. So you're not meeting your guests in person. You're actually using telecommunications like Zoom, what I'm using for my podcast. Or have you actually met some of the guests in person over the podcast? How does it work with you?
Yeah, I have. Wherever I can, I do it in person. So as I was saying, I'm going to an event this week, and I'll take my podcast mic with my laptop, and I've got some setup to do while I'm in South Africa. But I've also I was on the inaugural flight for Ethiopian from Manchester to Ethiopia, and I interviewed the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines at 30,000 feet. It was, it was a great way to do it, and really good fun as well. So I've done things like that. And yeah, wherever I can, I like to do them in person. So obviously, I think the other thing that comes into this, which you're obviously very good at too, is planning it and setting people up so they know what's coming, giving them editorial privilege as well. So they kind of know what you're going to ask, and if they're not happy, they can always take something out or whatever it may be. The other beauty of doing that is it really helps with some of these big corporate companies that have very tight communications policies, because they might not be allowed to go on live TV because the anchor might ask a really difficult question and they're stuck. They've got to answer it. Whereas I can give them that peace of mind that I'll kind of give you an idea of what I want to ask. And before we post it out, you will have the ability to listen back to it and approve it, and then help me share it as well. So I think as a medium, it works really well. But yeah, wherever possible, I think they work better in person, where you're sharing a coffee, you're in the same space, and it just makes for a better conversation. But I'm so used to doing them digitally, and it is easier to get the guest to say, hey, can I have an hour of your time, rather than obviously I can't travel somewhere just to do a podcast. It's not going to be commercially viable to do that, or good for the environment either, if I'm flying all around just to do an interview.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, actually, as you mentioned, digital made it much easier. And yes, what you mentioned, I do it myself. I prepare my questions in advance. I send it to the guest. I get their advice. We don't get a script. It's a spontaneous Q&A, but I need them, especially at the beginning. I think I'm still at my phase where I need to send most of the question in advance, because people need to know me. I'm still new. They need to understand that I'm safe, as you mentioned, to their corporate communication policy. But as it gets, as I'm getting advanced, I'm getting more people telling me, we can go ahead. It's just a chat. We can just discuss. Like our podcast, we didn't prepare the questions. We're both asking questions and getting answers in a spontaneous way. But I'm sure it was not easy at the beginning for you as it was for me. I'm sure you faced so many challenges and difficulties in the beginning, and there were moments when you were telling yourself, okay, this is not working, I should stop it. Can you share some of the stories of these low moments?
Of course. I mean, I think that with any entrepreneur, you have those moments, and there's that moment of doubt, and you're doing something different. That's why you're an entrepreneur. That's by definition, you're doing something that other people haven't done, even there are bigger players within the market. So the first thing was, I could see the shift in the way that people were communicating, and my blogs, it was two things. One was that there were a lot of work, and also LinkedIn, the algorithm it used to give you loads of visibility from a blog, and it started to drop. So the interaction and the visibility versus the payoff wasn't there. So I knew that podcast was new, not new around the world, but it's a relatively new thing in the African market. Nobody was doing it. And yeah, at the beginning, of course, you have challenges like, who am I going to interview, and how do I have any credibility to get them on my podcast? So you've just got to find a way to kind of, it wasn't that difficult because I was the only one. So I'm sort of saying to them, look, I just want some of your time to tell your story. You remember those days when people used to want to interview you by email? So they'd send you a load of questions, then you'd have to sit down and write the answer.
Yeah.
And that's way more time consuming than just jumping on a call and having a conversation. But yeah, it's the confidence, really. I mean, I'm not a broadcaster by nature, but obviously through the event, I had to stand up and chair the event and moderate panels, and you become confident because you have to be confident. And then when COVID hits as well, we were doing weekly webinars for the industry, so that builds your kind of confidence. But yeah, you know, my advice to all aspiring podcasters is do 10 episodes before you look at the numbers. Just do it, and do it because you want to do it and because you love it. Don't get het up on it's all about the response immediately, and don't go for like the top guest straight away, because it might be out of your reach until you've got a bit of credibility under your belt that they know you're a consistent presence and you're delivering quality.
Indeed. And as you mentioned about the 10 episodes and about being on camera and on the mic not being our nature, I'll share the same story. For me, I'm not producing the podcast myself alone. I have a team working with me. I know you don't actually need a team for that. It might, you're going to South Africa. I think you know how to just plug in, have the lights, have the mic, and go live and record it. But for me, I have my colleagues with me, working with me on the podcast. So for the first 10 episodes, I was not even looking at the podcast myself. I didn't review it because I hated myself. It's not my nature. I'm not used to being on camera. I don't like how my voice is. I don't like how I acted, how I spoke. So I was just publishing it, throwing myself before the audience. And then I started to improve. It started to getting easier and easier. But yeah, definitely it's worth it. It's not easy. That's why not everybody is doing it. But if it's done, it's worth it for everyone. Definitely, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because actually I really enjoy the editing part. I don't like listening to myself, but luckily with my podcast, probably 90% of the content is the guest and only 10% is me asking the questions, as with a normal thing. I know people aren't tuning in to listen to me, they're listening to my guests. So you know, from that side, I actually quite enjoy the editing, and I do it all myself. I do it all in-house, which takes the pressure off from a commercial basis. It allows me then to do podcasts that I think are interesting, rather than, oh, I have to go and find somebody who's going to pay to be on the podcast. You know, I think if all your podcasts are paid for appearances, people are going to turn off pretty quick, because they're going to think this is just one big, you know, advertising show, and I'm choosing to listen. I don't think many people can sit at their desk and their boss walks past and say, oh, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just listening to a podcast. And I think maybe in 5 years' time, that will be totally acceptable. But I think the culture that we have of that isn't work. People are choosing to listen in their free time. You have to make it interesting, and it has to be informative, but also entertaining. And also you need a guest that's going to tell a really interesting story that, yes, is business related in my respect, but we can make it quite informal, quite chatty, quite fun.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned being paid, having guests who paid for appearance on the podcast. I was recently reading an article that it's very common now for famous podcasters to be charging up to £50,000 just to appear on a podcast. For me, I'm very far away from that. I'm still asking people to give me a favor and be on my show. I don't know if you already reached a stage where you can charge for appearance on the podcast.
No, no, and I don't really want to, because again, it reduces the credibility. You know, as I was saying, there is a commercial benefit for some of our commercial partners to obviously use the podcast platform to tell their story. So it might be something that's built into a sponsorship of an event or something, you know, something like that, to give them some year-round coverage and some visibility. But genuinely, these people have really interesting stories to tell anyway. So, you know, it's good for everybody to have that. But in terms of sort of pay to play for something that should be content driven, I just feel like it's not really the right way to do it. Never say never. I mean, if somebody wants to pay £50,000 to come on the podcast, then we'll have a chat about it for sure. But I'm not sure they necessarily get the return on the investment for that. But obviously, if you've put the effort in and that's your only job, if you're somebody who's done 1,000 podcasts and you have 1 million listeners, then there's value, right? So that's in the eye of the beholder. I think that, again, those people who are starting out want to do a podcast, forget about that until you've built a following, until you've got some credibility in the bank. Then you can think about doing that sort of thing. But if you start with that process and you don't have a back catalog, I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, it's beneficial, as you mentioned, for everyone. If the podcaster can make money from the podcast, then they are able to specialize and to dedicate all their time for research and for the production, and then the quality of the show will be better. So it's like having a specialized TV or a media channel. Yeah, but as you mentioned, independence is very also important for everyone, and we're doing it to network and to share knowledge, not to make money. I appreciate all your advice and insight on the podcasts and its importance for the aviation industry. I would like also to discuss with you a little about AviaDev. It's a platform for air route development. Can you share with us what services you provide? Who are your clients? What services do and value do you add to them?
Okay, so the way it works, and we did our first live event for 3 years in Cape Town in the end of June this year. We have about 300 delegates attend the event. So it's a very focused event. We had 32 airlines attend at network planning or CEO, CCO level. And then we had about 50 airports represented from Africa and beyond. We had airports that are interested in getting African services as well. And the whole concept is that the morning is dedicated to conference sessions where we get the industry to speak. So we try and avoid politicians and associations. We get the actual CCOs, CEOs of airports and airlines, and the suppliers as well to actually talk about a particular topic. We record everything. That creates a white paper, etc. So it's very content heavy, but then the afternoons are dedicated to one-to-one meetings that are pre-arranged. And the whole concept there is that Kenya airports, for example, might sit down with Qatar Airways for 20 minutes and we have 20-minute slots. And it's their job there to present a business case to Qatar why they should start flying or increase frequencies or put a bigger aircraft on the route. And they can build those relationships and pitch to each other. So we delivered about 500 of those pre-arranged meetings. And then, of course, there's all the informal meetings around it. And then from a commercial perspective, we have sponsors and partners like Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, SETA, some huge companies from all around the world and some African suppliers as well. And they come to meet with these people too, to present their services and sell their services too. But it's very niche. It's very focused. It's very, we would like to think, very well run. It's very professional in the way that the stage is done. And then we make a big impact locally as well, where we put all the sessions out for free. We bring in local people to help us deliver the event. We have ambassadors who are from the industry that haven't necessarily got the opportunities yet, and we do charity runs and all sorts of outreach projects alongside the event. So yeah, the feedback was that 99% of people who came in 2022 said they'll come to 2023's event. So could get slightly better than that if we could get to 100, but I'm pretty happy with 99. That's fine.
I look forward to attending myself. It's very interesting. And frankly, I didn't know about it before I got to know you as a podcaster and guest, and I look forward to next year edition. So it's a conference, but throughout the year, do you provide any consulting services for airports, for example? What do you do other than the podcast?
No, we don't. I mean, really, it's through the year, it's working with our host. So obviously it was Cape Town in 2022. We're in the process now of finalizing who our host will be for 2023. So we plug into them and we support their destination with their messaging. You know, who is it you're trying to attract? What is it you're trying to say? So we would obviously get people from that host organization, give them the platform. I also do LinkedIn training alongside this, and then of course create the podcast and do that sort of thing and attend all the African events. And where I'm needed, I'll moderate at those events and I'll cover them like news articles. And yeah, we look at other opportunities as well. But realistically, my main focus is on the event once a year, and then providing ecosystem through the year of content that's interesting and staying relevant. Because what I've seen, as I was saying earlier, is that very often you'll do the event and people just run off to another event and they ignore the industry. I feel like we have to be in the industry through the year. The industry doesn't stop just because I've delivered the event. And we see that with most events, to be honest. But yeah, it's my passion. It's my focus is African aviation. So yeah, really, really excited to keep doing it and supporting the connectivity because it's growing. And there's a huge opportunity in Africa.
Absolutely. Actually, air connectivity is one of the main issues in Africa, and helping solve it will actually help all the people of Africa and all the people doing business with Africa. And what you're doing in this regard is very interesting, and I admire what you do. So, Jon, before we close this podcast, I'm sure the audience would like to hear a couple of points from you on what they should do to start a successful business or a successful podcast in the aviation industry. What do you recommend them to do?
Wow, what a great question. I think that the first thing is that prolific's better than perfect. Okay, so just start. If you've got a concept, don't procrastinate too much about, is it going to work? Is it not going to work? The world we live in now, there's access to a lot of information, like your podcast and mine, which is free to access, to skill yourself in whatever it is that you're going to do. I think the second thing is to focus in on a niche. I'm a big believer that you don't need millions of followers. It shouldn't be growth at all costs and numbers are the only thing that you're looking for. It should be quality. And if you can become a trusted voice, then that attracts influence, that attracts opportunities. People think, right, I need somebody for African aviation. And hopefully they think, oh, Jon would be a good guy to come to. And it's the same thing. So I think focus in on what you do and stick to that. Don't be tempted to go and do different topics and different things too much that are away from your core, because then you become this jack of all trades and you become less valuable within your industry. So for me, it's about spend the time to get to know the community. I built the business first and foremost, mostly through digital means, because 80% of my time I'm in the UK. And then that 20% of actually going to the industry and going to events, meeting people, making those connections, that's the secret sauce. You can't do it all digitally, but you can't do it all in person either, unless you've got a blank checkbook. So for me, it's a case of build it slowly, but make some noise and find that niche that nobody else is serving. And always ask that question. Is what I'm posting, is what I'm doing, giving more value than I'm expecting in return? Don't make it a self-serving process, which may sound counterintuitive, but ultimately people are going to buy something where they see value, and that value is going to come from what you produce, not where you're going to get value immediately. And the final thing is be patient, because it takes time. And I think you and I know that, but it's a passion. So, it's got to be your passion first and foremost.
Thank you, Jon. I really appreciate the valuable advice. I'm sure the audience will find it very valuable as well. And I hope we see many people starting to create content and podcast in the beautiful aviation industry we're working on.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for having me on the show, Adnan. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Jon. Thank you to all the audience who joined us today. I'm sure you found very valuable input, very valuable advice and steps to start creating content. And I hope to see many of you starting podcasts and creating content in this aviation industry, so we can share the knowledge, learn from each other, and make the industry more successful, interesting, and profitable. Have a great day. See you again next week with another guest and another episode of AviaPreneurs podcast. Have a great day.